Big day in U.S. politics today. Here's a live shot of downtown Manhattan. That is a camera stakeout of the Trump Tower. Everyone waiting to see Donald Trump emerge from that building, his building, jump into the limo. Well, we'll leave that shot and let me show you where he's heading to next. I think we have that live shot as well. The polling station where our own Lindsay Duncombe is waiting. She's going to be covering things from here all through the day. Voters already there, but that is where Donald Trump is scheduled to cast his vote in the New York primary at some point this hour. So stay with us for coverage here on CBC News Network. There are 95 delegates up for grabs, and we're going to talk about how those figure into the equation with Keith Boag on this very big day, perfect day for a primary primer. Good morning, Keith in Washington.
Good morning, Heather, in Toronto.
In Toronto. I bet you're wishing you're in New York because there's so much to talk about there. And listen, we might as well just jump right in on the Republicans. 95 delegates I mentioned. For Donald Trump, the front runner, this is a very key day because the thinking is he needs to take at least 85 of the 95 delegates. He wants to win them all, but to win them all, he has to fight this system that he says is rigged. What should we be watching for on this today?
Well, I think he's probably going to be fine in New York. He has been making a lot of complaints about the system for a couple of weeks now, but in many ways that is just sowing the ground for a complaint he thinks he might need to make when we get to the Republican convention in July in Cleveland. But there are things that have been happening in other states that are finally getting Donald Trump's attention and are causing him some worry and provoking some anger. I'm thinking in particular Georgia this weekend. Donald Trump won Georgia quite handily, had 37% of the vote on Super Tuesday, March 1st. And that meant that he got 42 delegates. Last weekend, just 3 days ago, was the weekend when they had conventions to decide who those delegates would actually be. And at least one precinct, the 7th precinct, the delegates are all three of them are going to be Ted Cruz supporters. These are what are called sinos. Now, sinos sounds like rhinos and is similar. Rhinos, as you probably know, Republicans in name only. Sinos are supporters in name only, and now Donald Trump is finding out that some of the people he thought were on his team actually aren't. The question is, how much farther does this extend in other precincts, other states across the country? How many of those delegates who Trump thought he won on primary day are actually going to be somebody else's supporters, probably Ted Cruz's supporters, by the time they get to the convention? That means they'll be committed to vote for Trump on the first ballot, but they'll be voting for Cruz on other ballots. So what this reveals, I think, about the campaign, and it's important, is that Ted Cruz understood from the beginning that he wasn't going to win this on the first ballot, and he has been organizing for a long time for a second ballot. Also, he has come to understand, and I think it's clear to everybody now, that it's going to be very difficult for Donald Trump to win on a first ballot. So Cruz can't win on a first ballot. Trump can only win on a first ballot is the dynamic heading into the convention in July.
This is so interesting, all of the machinations that are going on behind the scene. This vote is just part of it, obviously part of the story today. But can we come back to the numbers? I mean, obviously, if he gets those 95, he's still hoping and saying he can win the 1237 delegates necessary outright. But moving on to the contested convention, there are those who are thinking it's more and more likely. And you and I were emailing last night. You got a little bit of advanced reading material to get you set for that. You have to share that with us this morning, Keith.
This is great. I mean, we know we're going to an historic convention and that people are going to write books about it for years afterwards. But who thought that somebody would write a book about it before it actually happened? This is it. Arrived on my doorstep last night. It's called Chaos, The Outsider's Guide to a Contested Republican National Convention in 2016. This next convention. And it's a great read. I've only just started it, but it's filled with all kinds of history, facts, political analysis, strategy, personality, and so on, that all leads the writer to the conclusion that a contested convention is, first of all, inevitable, and second, going to be chaotic. It's written by a fellow called John Yob, who was an operative with the Marco Rubio campaign, so he comes at it from an insider's perspective. Interestingly, though, Heather, he began writing this book in 2010 when the Tea Party was on the rise, and he foresaw that the Tea Party insurgency was a meaningful thing that would one day, probably soon, challenge the Republican establishment and try to contest for the presidential nomination of the party. He did not foresee Donald Trump. He did not foresee a billionaire media personality coming into the race. But as he says in the book, that only adds to the chaos.
Well, it certainly does. All right. Well, good reading, and share some of what you're learning on subsequent primaries.
Absolutely.
Let's flip to the Democrats. I mean, the Republicans, I mean, it's crazy. They haven't had a tight race in New York State for 40 years. So they're following this very closely. But there's lots of reason to watch the Democrats very closely as well. Hillary Clinton, same situation as Donald Trump, really. She doesn't just have to win. She has to win big today because, what some have been saying, an interesting thought, the perception is that the people want Sanders, the party wants Clinton. She needs to erase that with some big numbers today.
Yeah, and I think that perception is a kind of a romantic perception that was inevitable when Sanders started to do well. I mean, he captures people's imagination. There is, I think, a natural tendency in many, many people to want to root for the underdog, and the underdog he certainly is. But New York is not his state for a couple of reasons. First of all, Clinton has a lot of history there. She was twice elected as a senator. But perhaps just as important or even more important is the fact that it's a closed primary. Bernie Sanders does well among independent voters. Independent voters are not going to be voting in this primary. It's for Democrats only. And unless you were registered as a Democrat in October, that's quite a while ago, unless you were registered then, you're not going to be able to vote. So he's got these things going against him. Clinton should be able to come out of this with the kind of win that she really does need to convince people that she has the popular broad base of support that it takes to be the nominee. She has other indications of that as well. She has more than 2 million more votes than Bernie Sanders has. She has more delegates than he has, pledged delegates. She has more establishment or super delegates. She beats him in every way. But again, he appears to have this kind of momentum, and there is this kind of romantic feeling about rooting for an underdog. People like his message. They like what he's saying. They really want to believe that it's all going to mean something in the end.
Can you shelve this away for next week? Because leading up to today, it's been interesting. Their back and forth has become increasingly bitter. The fight over qualifications, for example, and some in the Democratic Party are really concerned that their fight has led into the danger zone, as they're calling it, a negative, lasting effect on the Democratic brand, heading in. So let's keep that shelved away, and we see what the outcome of New York is, and we'll bring that into the conversation on future discussions, okay?
Talk to you then, Heather.